Ernest Hemingway once wrote, "The world is a fine place and worth fighting for." I agree with the second part.
1995 saw the worst of humanity writ large, from the front page to the nightly news. The reeling aftermath of a Rwandan genocide, a terrorist bombing in Oklahoma, sarin attacks on the Tokyo subway. The year's most televised event? A murder trial. Inevitably, this sour ambience seeped into the escapism of the cinema. It's startling to see just how many of 1995's most important works were soaked in despair, as filmmakers tried to sift through the sodden mess. Amongst them, David Fincher's Seven is rightfully cited as one of the decade's finest thrillers, in part because of just how meticulously it captured these dark nights of the soul. This is a place where abhorrent acts go unpunished or ignored, and no rung of the social ladder can escape the wrath of God. While everyone remembers its stinging shocks and "What's in the f***ing box?" Andrew Kevin Walker's screenplay isn't just a nihilistic Rubik's Cube dipped in black paint. There's a finger in the damn futility to our two detectives sifting for light in the infinite dank, but the beauty is in the characters and the devil is in the details. Mills skimming Cliff's notes while Somerset pours through archives and libraries, the wonderful domestic vignette of a home-cooked meal in a shaking shithole apartment, the blend of abject terror and deep regret on Somerset's face when Tracy confides that she's going to bring a child into a world fallen to ruin.
Oh, Tracy.
Seven is about good intentions crushed by a hopeless place, the omnipresence of evil, and the subjective, ever-changing nature of sin. All the forensic detail and cat-and-mouse clue-chasing is just sugar for these bitter philosophical pills, and it's as intoxicating now as it was back in the mid-90s. You might be thinking, based on its Spartan plot and procedural structure, Seven's formula surely wouldn't be that hard to emulate. Well, as it turns out, you'd be very, very wrong. As with any zeitgeist-grabbing critical and commercial success, Seven had its fair share of copycat killers waiting to strike. After turning down the role of Mills in Seven, Denzel Washington was quick to sign on to the ho-hum Fallen. The production design is suspiciously similar, as is the willingness to splash around in its own depressing filth, but it never manages to gel it by-the-book policing with its more supernatural strangeness. Saw is the most obvious bastard child of Fincher's tall glass of bad vibes, and it's a series I'm unashamedly fond of. Some of the entries are better than others, with the lesser installments feeling like parodies of themselves, but they've built such a ridiculous, convoluted mythology that I can't help but root for their trashy continuation. Horseman is exactly the kind of grey mush you're served up when you get Michael Bay to produce a Canadian straight-to-DVD whodunit about a biblically minded revenge cult. And then there's Resurrection, one of my least favourite films of the 90s, and a formulaic copy so brazen they even cast Screaming Knife Penis as one of the lead detectives. How bad is it? Well, here's a synopsis of the plot. During Lent, Christopher Lambert must track down a homicidal psychopath who's taken to using the limbs of his victims to reconstruct the body of Jesus Christ.
What?
Not to let the Tinseltown culture vultures hoover up all the scraps for themselves, publisher Zenescope Entertainment returned to Fincher's Poisoned Well with a series of comic books set before and during the events of the film. Blurring the source material's colour palette of mud pie brown and Granny's peach tea yellow with an illustrative style that dramatically shifts from issue to issue, it's a shame the eclecticism and artistry of Seven's comic book prequel is at the behest of completely redundant storytelling. The 7 volumes flip between 2 arcs. Flashbacks of John Doe growing from a religiously indoctrinated problem child to a judgmental psychopath, and a parallel retelling of the film from John's perspective. The worst thing about this serviceable but completely uncalled for series is the way in which it robs the film of its enigmatic, malicious fog. On screen, we follow the protagonists who are complementary but always clashing. John Doe is the itch that can never be scratched, a force of nature that can't be undone by gumshoe grind or traditional psychoanalysis. In the comics, Somerset and Mills are largely absent, stripping each issue of anything close to a beating heart. As for John Doe, here he's just every generic fear of God, fire and brimstone Fruit Loop you've ever seen, thereby turning him from a fascinating monster into a textbook fundamentalist weirdo. Then there are the murders, now depicted vividly as and when they happen, which just feels like misguided bloodlust, considering we're already intimately familiar with the nauseating aftermath. So beyond these serialized pages of black mold morbidity, why was there never a proper cinematic sequel? Well, there kind of is, and it is fucking terrible. In the early 2000s, New Line Cinema, in all its piss-junk basset hound trying to fillet firework wisdom, really wanted to produce a follow-up to Seven's perfectly singular story, thereby defanging one of the most iconic endings of all time.
Oh God! Oh God!
Rather than asking Andrew Kevin Walker to type up another 120 pages of muck and mire, New Line Cinema instead opted to salvage an unproduced junk drawer screenplay and slap the name 8 on it. The problem? Nobody involved with Seven wanted anything to do with a script about Morgan Freeman's Somerset developing psychic powers and using them to hunt down a murderous fortune teller. So New Line Cinema swapped Morgan Freeman with Anthony Hopkins and released it as an unrelated standalone feature in 2015, with the new title, Solace. In Solace, the FBI hire a psychic to try and track down an omnipotent serial killer who uses his precognitive abilities to see the future, then execute a bunch of terminally ill people before they even know they're sick. It's even dumber than it sounds, and it sounds very dumb indeed. Seven's DNA spews out of Solace like a broken condom of bad ideas. There's a hyper-intelligent killer with a biblical grand design and a proclivity for leaving enigmatic notes, an experienced older investigator and a hot-headed hunk, references to classical literature and high art, and a late-in-the-day reveal of a big-name star playing the killer. So what's the difference? Well, okay, this one is extremely good, and this one feels like spending a fortnight in a bad balloon.
They fucked it up!
For a start, Solace doesn't have a start. There's a screen of text explaining what the title means, because one should always assume their audience is stupid, before skipping any semblance of an opening act, and jumping in at the point where our stumped detectives hire a psychic to crack a plot that the filmmakers never bothered to establish. The mental powers are mainly used as a convoluted form of GPS.
Take a left!
But he went straight.
Take a left!
Although Clancy does get a glimpse of the killer in his very first vision, but then just opts not to tell anyone, because, I don't know, maybe he's just a dick. As for our big bad's nefarious plan, Solace seems to think it's ideologically complex because it suggests he's mercy killing the terminally ill to cut short their suffering. I mean, he could just use his precognition to help them catch their conditions early, but then the film wouldn't happen. In an unconscionably written moment of poor taste, the killer chooses one victim because they have HIV, which Solace is very adamant to declare as a death sentence, thereby conflating a chronic but manageable disease with an agonizing, unavoidable and undignified death. Who could have expected such a lack of tact, consideration and nuance from the writer of Tower Heist?
You fucked it up! Again!
If you step away from this mouth-breathing, misbegotten failure, and the misfiring knockoffs that came before, there are plenty of exemplary original works that understand what Seven stood for and are more than capable of carrying the torch. I Saw the Devil, Prisoners, and Martyrs all slink around in the same shadows, where loving reverence never intrudes on their layered characterization and rug-pulling revelations. Then you've got 8mm, arguably the closest thing Seven has to a sibling. Both were written by Andrew Kevin Walker and are about as optimistic as a pig in a war, but 8mm licks at the boot of taboo-chasing dread, wallowing in sun-bleached Hollywood and taking a razor blade to the eye of lurid voyeurism. It's a jaded, deeply upsetting invitation into the garbage bag wallpaper of backroom sexual exploitation and extreme pornography. Mixing the fetishistic neo-noir of Paul Schrader's hardcore with the obscenity of under-the-counter sleaze, 8mm remains an incredibly tough watch all these years later. Yet, with a few minor tweaks and an overhauled visual identity, it's not hard to imagine a version of this working as a commendable attempt at a sequel to Seven, regardless of how against the idea I am. So why is this particular cops versus serial killer story so damned hard to pin down and reproduce? Few, if any, have come close to cinematographer Darius Khondji's stunning slideshow of mildew and misery, or David Fincher's something to prove, nothing to lose directorial vision, coming off the back of Alien 3's failure. In 1995, as society looked down the barrel of a new millennium, it captured anxieties both secular and religious, and in turn there was a twisted catharsis to its cruelty, comfortably existing outside of time or geography. Decades later, Seven feels like a nightmare in a bottle, something we can admire and explore, but an artifact we'd do best to leave well alone. A heaping bowl of spaghetti for our Patreon producers Jennifer C, Claire MD, Becky O, and Nicholas Lair-Revere, and Brad Pitt's goatee for all these amazing folks over on Patreon who so kindly support the channel. So what more recent films do you think have captured the intelligence and energy of Seven? Let us know down in the comments, and feel free to sound off about the best and worst knockoffs of this incredible film. If you'd like to support the channel, the best way is to share these videos on social media, make sure you're subscribed, like, and leave a comment for engagement, and if you'll click the link in the description below, you can head over to our Patreon, where you can sign up to get your name in the credits, access to the In Frame Out Film Club, and a place in our private Discord server. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, this is In Frame Out.